Nurse Morrison, your basic competency is once again in question. That is what Dr. Blackwell said 47 minutes before a 7-foot gunman would kick open the OR prep area and change everything. Katie Morrison moves through Oak Creek Memorial in Philadelphia with the quiet efficiency of someone trying to be invisible. 18 months on the floor, always early, always precise, her hand steady as she checks medication logs under fluorescent lights that hum against white tile. She wears scrubs one size too large and keeps her hair pulled back tight enough that it pulls at her temples. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her collar, hangs a single dog tag on a broken chain that she touches once when she thinks no one is looking, the metal warm against her collarbone, a gravity she never puts down. A slight tremor runs through her left hand when she's tired, a detail she hides by keeping that hand in her pocket or holding a clipboard or reaching for something that requires both palms flat. The other nurses know almost nothing about her. No social media. No stories about her past. She deflects every personal question with a polite smile that doesn't reach her eyes, and they've learned not to push. It is 2:14 p.m. when Dr. Blackwell arrives for rounds on the post-op recovery unit. He arrives the way he always does, with his entourage, 3 residents and a medical student trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. His eyes are scanning the corridor for her before he even reaches the nursing station. He finds her in room for 12, checking the flow on a 68-year-old man recovering from spinal fusion surgery, Mr. Carmichael, who has his 2 adult children sitting in chairs beside the bed with the particular exhaustion that comes from watching your parents' body betray them. Morrison, Blackwell says, not a greeting. A summons. His voice carries the kind of condescension that enters a room like a temperature drop, and Katie feels it the moment he speaks, the air pressure changing, the way his presence makes the fluorescent light seem dimmer, less forgiving. She's learned to recognize this particular timbre. It means he has an audience and he intends to use it. Katie straightens without rushing. She turns slowly. The tremor in her left hand retreats behind her back. "Doctor," she says. Just that. Just the single word, measured, her voice like still water, no greeting warmth, no deference that would invite him closer. Blackwell steps into the room with the territorial confidence of someone who has never been told no in an institution where everyone wears his title. He glances at the monitor showing Mr. Carmichael's vitals, O2 sat 97, heart rate 68, blood pressure holding stable at 128/82, and then his gaze lands on the site, the bandage Katie had just secured 40 minutes ago. "This dressing," he says, pointing without looking at her. "Tell me the protocol." Katie has changed the dressing 3 times in 18 months according to post-operative standard. She knows the protocol. She also knows that Blackwell didn't stop in this room to ask about bandages. She looks at him once, holds that look, and answers anyway. "Sterile field, chlorhexidine wash, new dressing per post-op orders," she says. Each phrase separate. Each one correct. And the frequency. His voice is a blade, sharpened specifically for her. Every 12 hours or if compromised. Last changed 47 minutes ago. Blackwell turns to face her directly now, and his expression shifts into something rehearsed, theatrical. He's performing. The residents are watching. Mr. Carmichael's children are watching. Katie sees Mr. Carmichael's son lean forward, a slight tension around his mouth that says he recognizes when someone is being humiliated regardless of the words being used. "Morrison, your basic competency is once again in question," Blackwell says, and his voice fills the room like smoke. "Because this dressing was already in place when I examined Mr. Carmichael at 1:30 this afternoon, and in post-operative care, dressings do not spontaneously require changing. Either you are applying unnecessary procedures that might compromise healing, or you are not recording them accurately. Which is it?" The room goes very still. The ventilator in the corner hisses its mechanical rhythm. Outside the window, rain hammers the Philadelphia streets like applause nobody asked for. Katie doesn't move. She doesn't blink. She doesn't explain that she changed the dressing because she found a pinhole-sized separation in the edge, something a residence-level assessment might have missed but something her hands knew to fix. She doesn't say anything at all. She simply looks at him with a flat, cold stare that holds absolutely no emotion, and when the silence stretches long enough that Blackwell's jaw tightens imperceptibly, she opens her mouth and says, "Your insecurity is showing, doctor." Then she turns and walks out of room for 12. She doesn't wait for a response. She doesn't wait to see his face rearrange itself. She simply walks, her shoulders back, her stride exactly as calm as it was before he spoke, and the sound of her shoes on the tile floor is the only thing that breaks the silence. Mr. Carmichael's daughter gasps slightly. One of the residents shifts his weight. Blackwell doesn't follow her. Katie walks to the break room because she needs to sit down for exactly 60 seconds, needs to open her locker and look at the single photograph she keeps there, a landscape of mountains she's never seen and likely never will. She places her left hand against her thigh, and she waits for the tremor to settle. Her breathing is even. Her pulse is steady. She's been trained by people who would recognize panic in a heartbeat, and she has spent 7 years teaching herself not to show it. When she opens the break room door, there are 4 other nurses sitting at the table: Chen, Morris, Ramirez, and the new grad whose name she hasn't bothered to learn because the new grads never stay. All 4 of them stop talking the moment she crosses the threshold. All 4 of them stand and leave. They don't make excuses. They don't pretend they were leaving anyway. Morris doesn't even grab her coffee. They simply rise as if they've received a signal and file out past Katie, their eyes focused on anything but her face. The new grad is the last one out, and she walks a little faster than the others, as if being near Katie is contagious, as if standing too close to someone Blackwell has targeted might transfer the designation to them. The break room door swings shut. Katie doesn't sit. She stands at the counter and fills a water cup from the dispenser, and she drinks it slowly, and she doesn't let the isolation settle into her chest the way it wants to. She's been alone before. She's been alone for 7 years. She's been alone in a room surrounded by people, and she's been alone in the actual dark of a desert, and she knows how to survive both. The loneliness of a break room is a luxury compared to the loneliness of Marja. The call comes through the intercom at 2:48 p.m. Trauma alert, Bay 1, ETA 3 minutes, the dispatcher's voice is clipped, professional. GSW, male, 68 years old, transferred from Philadelphia Regional. Paramedics en route with vitals. Katie is standing in the post-op unit when she hears it. The floor vibrates with the particular energy that comes with trauma, the attending physicians moving faster, the surgical team mobilizing, the quiet urgency that transforms a hospital from routine to emergency. She watches the staff consolidate. She watches them move toward the trauma bay like cells moving toward a stimulus. She doesn't move. Not yet. The paramedics arrive with the stretcher at 2:51 p.m., the wheels squeaking against the linoleum with a sound like something dying. They're running, but controlled, and the EMT at the head of the stretcher is calling out numbers: BP 88/56 and dropping, heart rate 124, respiratory distress, GSW to the left anterior thorax, and Katie hears the numbers the way she hears everything now, with the part of her that never actually left her FOB in Helmand Province. The patient's face comes into focus as they pass her station. The oxygen mask covers half his face, but Katie would recognize the other half anywhere. The scar tissue along his left temple. The particular shape of his jaw. Colonel Harrison Thorne, retired 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the man who court-martialed her 7 years ago in Marja on the basis of classified evidence she was never allowed to see, the man who destroyed her career and her clearance and everything she built with his signature on a single piece of paper. The man whose testimony sent her back to the States, dishonorably discharged, her service record sealed, her name scrubbed from every roster she'd ever served on. The man whose life is now hemorrhaging into a stretcher as paramedics wheel him past her. Katie watches him disappear into the trauma bay. She watches the doors swing shut. She watches the nursing staff converge like a school of fish around a predator, everyone moving, everyone necessary, everyone present except for the one person who knows exactly who is lying on that table and exactly why his presence here now, in this moment, means something that nobody else in this hospital could possibly understand. Nobody else knows that the man bleeding in Bay 1 is the same man who destroyed her entire life. Nobody else knows that she's been invisible in this hospital for 18 months while the universe has been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. The fluorescent lights hum overhead like they're recording the silence. What the hospital didn't know was that Katie Morrison had spent 7 years not recognizing her own name in crowds, 7 years flinching at the sound of boots on tile, 7 years learning to make herself small enough to disappear. What they didn't know was that the quiet nurse they'd hired, the one who came in early and stayed late and asked for nothing and complained about nothing, had once been a different person entirely, someone with a call sign and a rank and a string of deployments that had left scars no uniform could cover. What they didn't know was that she was about to stop being invisible. The medication error was in Dr. Blackwell's handwriting, a dosage that would have sent the patient's potassium into cardiac arrest. Katie caught it during the 6 a.m. chart review, quietly crossed it out with a single line, initialed the correction, and entered the right dose without mentioning it to anyone. It wasn't her job to police his orders. It wasn't her place to correct a physician. But she was a nurse, and nurses didn't let patients die from math mistakes. 3 hours later, Blackwell pulled her aside in the hallway outside ICU and told her she was being reassigned effective immediately. Your inability to follow established protocols without questioning physician judgment is a liability, he said, his voice smooth as a knife sliding into skin. I'm moving you to post-op recovery. All 4 of your current patients will transition to staff better suited to their acuity level. Katie listened without expression. The hallway fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry insects. She could see the charge nurse 20 feet away, deliberately looking at her clipboard instead of at either of them. Understood, Katie said. I'm glad you understand, Nurse Morrison. Because questioning my clinical decisions is insubordination. And insubordination has consequences. He smiled then, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes and means nothing. Don't let it happen again. The second strike came during afternoon rounds, when Katie's assessment of a post-op patient actually prevented a catastrophe. Mr. Reeves had been admitted 3 days earlier with what Blackwell diagnosed as simple post-operative pain. Katie noticed something the chart didn't reflect. The left side of his face was drooping when he spoke, his speech slightly slurred. She documented it, possible stroke indicators, recommend neurological consult. Blackwell dismissed it during rounds. Postoperative disorientation. Common. Nurse Morrison, sometimes patients experience psychological symptoms after surgery. Not everything is a medical emergency. But the left-sided weakness persisted. By evening, Katie called the hospitalist directly and asked for a stroke protocol evaluation. The hospitalist ordered an immediate CT. The scan showed a clot in the middle cerebral artery, a massive stroke in progress, the kind that kills people or leaves them permanently disabled if not treated within a few hours. They got him to neurointerventional radiology at 19 minutes past the window. The thrombectomy worked. Mr. Reeves lived, and he walked out of Oak Creek Memorial 5 days later with minor residual weakness and a full life ahead. During the next morning's rounds, Dr. Blackwell stood at the foot of Mr. Chen's bed, a new admission, here for pneumonia, now under Blackwell's care. The patient's adult son and daughter sat in chairs by the window, and Katie had just finished explaining that the family had researched alternative pain management protocols and specifically requested one that might address their father's sensitivity to opioids. The family had done their homework. They'd brought 3 peer-reviewed articles. They were being advocates, and Katie had supported that. It was what good nursing looked like. Blackwell's jaw tightened when he heard what they were asking for. Nurse Morrison, he said, and his voice had changed into something colder, your basic competency is once again in question. This protocol requires physician-level pharmacological understanding, which you clearly lack. I will not have my patients endangered by a floor nurse with delusions of medical expertise. He pulled out his tablet and began typing, not looking at Katie, his fingers moving with deliberate precision. Making it official. Writing her up where everyone could see. The son and daughter stared at their hands. Mr. Chen pressed his lips together, understanding that his request had somehow hurt the nurse who'd been kind to him. Katie met Blackwell's eyes. She didn't look away. 5 full seconds of stare, the kind of cold flat look that came from staring down convoy ambushes and field hospital chaos and men with more power than conscience. When he finally stopped typing and glanced up, expecting to see shame or apology, he found neither. "Your insecurity is showing, Doctor," Katie said, her voice like a scalpel cutting through surgical silk. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with his mouth still open, his face beginning to flush red. She heard him call after her. She didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She walked out of the room and down the hallway with her hand steady and her breathing even, and the trembling that wanted to come, the rage that wanted to crack through her composure. She locked that down tight where no one could see it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came an hour later when Katie walked into the break room to sit alone with her lunch, seeking maybe 5 minutes of quiet before the next shift began. The break room had 3 other nurses in it, respiratory therapist Marcus, cardiac floor nurse Sarah, and one of the newer RNs named Jennifer. They'd been friendly with Katie before Blackwell's campaign began. They'd grabbed lunch together. They'd complained about scheduling in that bonded way hospital staff does. The moment Katie walked in, all 3 of them gathered their things. No words. No excuses. They just stood up, took their plates and phones, and walked past her toward the door like she was already a ghost. "See you around," Marcus said to nobody in particular, not making eye contact. They left. Katie sat alone in the empty break room with antiseptic smell and humming vending machines, and she ate her sandwich with mechanical precision, each bite the same size, each chew the same number of times, like fuel going into a machine. She could see staff walking past through the window in the break room door. Nurses she'd trained with. Tech she'd covered for. People she'd called on during codes and crises. They glanced in as they passed. They moved on. By late afternoon, there was new red writing on the unit board visible to all staff. Her name. Disciplinary watch. The charge nurse had a thin line between her lips when she handed Katie a copy of the formal documentation. Insubordination. Undermining physician authority. Failure to respect chain of command. The words were Blackwell's, but they were official now. They were in the system. When Katie approached the main nursing station to review her schedule, the 3 staff members already standing there made excuses and dispersed. One younger nurse actually backed away, as if proximity to Katie might be contagious. The isolation was precise and complete. Blackwell had orchestrated it perfectly, not with rules or official mandates, but with enough public humiliation and threats that everyone understood associating with Katie Morrison was dangerous. She was still reviewing her new post-op assignment when the overhead intercom crackled and a voice cut through the afternoon. "Trauma alert, incoming. GSW to chest. Estimated time of arrival for minutes." The nursing station erupted into controlled chaos. Everyone moved at once, checking which trauma bays were available, notifying the trauma surgeon, preparing supplies. Katie stepped aside as senior staff rushed past her, and the charge nurse called out assignments in rapid sequence. Everyone got a role. Everyone except Katie, who stood at the periphery with her hands in her pockets, watching. Then the trauma surgeon turned and looked directly at her. "Morrison, you're on OR prep. The main bay is already set, but we need the crash cart restocked and secondary instruments laid out in case we need an emergency thoracotomy. Move." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Katie moved. She was already changing direction, already walking toward the pre-op area, already pulling on fresh gloves with sharp snapping sounds that echoed through the preparation bay. Her hands found the supplies they needed without her having to think about the sequence: 14-gauge angiocath needles, units of O-negative blood, crystalloid 4 bags, the titanium chest spreader that lived in the difficult-access drawer. Muscle memory took over. Not from nursing school. From something much older. From field hospitals where there was no time for hesitation and mistakes meant body bags. The paramedics arrived for minutes and 12 seconds later, rolling a stretcher with a man in his late 60s, maybe older. GSW to the left chest, entry wound visible, no exit wound, patient unconscious but breathing. The man's face was grey and slack with shock and blood loss. As they transferred him from the stretcher to the surgical table, Katie's hands moved to secure the 4 lines, to cut away the soaked clothing, to prepare him for the surgeon's knife. Then she looked at his face fully for the first time. The world went very still. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. The patient was unconscious, older and grayer than memory, but the bone structure beneath the decades didn't change. The small scar along his left temple, that was the same. The way his chin angled downward, that was the same too. The tattoo on his left shoulder blade, partially visible where his shirt had been cut away, coordinates. Latitude and longitude. The kind of coordinates that meant something to people who'd been deployed to places where coordinates mattered. 7 years. That's how long since she'd seen Colonel Raymond Voss. The officer who'd court-martialed her in Marja. The officer who'd called her a liar in front of her entire unit. The officer who destroyed her career and left her broken enough that she'd had to disappear 2,000 miles and start her entire life over with a different name and a different past, and a daughter who didn't know her mother had once been someone with a rank and a uniform, and 214 Marines who would have died for her before Voss decided she was expendable. Katie's left hand found the dog tag beneath her scrubs, single piece of metal on a broken chain, the one thing she'd kept, the one thing she couldn't throw away. Her fingers closed around it so hard the metal bit into her palm. "Okay," the charge nurse asked, looking at her with something like concern. "You good?" "Yes," Katie said, and her voice had changed into something else entirely. Not the deferential floor nurse's voice. Something colder. Something that made the charge nurse take a small step backward. "I'm good." They were prepping him for emergency surgery. Getting the anesthesia line in, running the rapid transfuser, calling out vitals. Katie worked with the precision of her instrument, laying out the secondary supplies, checking the defibrillator pads, positioning the crash cart where it needed to be. Her movements had become something different than they'd been even an hour ago. Sharper. Military. The kind of movement that came from a time when her job was life and death and every motion mattered. The OR door slammed open. Everything stopped. The man who filled the doorway was 7 feet of rage and desperation, tattoos covering both arms, a sawed-off shotgun held with both hands, his eyes wild and unfocused like he'd been running on adrenaline and no sleep for about 36 hours. The shooter. The one who'd botched the robbery attempt on the street and followed his victim here to finish what he'd started. "The old man dies today," he screamed, and the shotgun came up. The surgeon dropped his instrument tray. The sound it made was like breaking glass mixed with screaming metal. One of the nurses shrieked. The anesthesiologist dove behind the equipment cart, his hands covering his head. The charge nurse bolted for the side exit, calling out a code that nobody heard over the sound of chaos. Everyone ran. The entire OR staff scattered for the back doors, the side exits, anywhere away from the barrel of that weapon, which had a capacity for destruction that didn't care about protocols or training or how many lives hung in the balance. Everyone except Katie Morrison. She took 3 steps directly toward him. The gun swung toward her. The man's finger tightened on the trigger. "Stay back." Katie kept walking. Her hands were open and visible. Her face was completely calm. There was no fear in her eyes, just the kind of cold clarity that comes from having already survived the worst the world had to offer. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. "What's your name?" The gunman's breathing came in ragged bursts, his pupils blown wide and unfocused. 7 feet of muscle and desperation, sweat dripping down a face that hadn't slept in maybe 36 hours. The sawed-off shotgun trembled in his hands like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "My name's not important," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. Katie took another step forward. Hand still visible. Empty. The motion was slow enough that it registered as non-threatening, fast enough that it showed she wasn't afraid. "Okay. That's okay. But I need you to tell me something. What's your name?" The man's eyes flickered between her and the colonel on the operating table. The surgical lights cast everything in a stark, shadowless white that made the room feel like the inside of a bone. Behind them, the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and indifferent. The anesthesia line ran into the colonel's arm like a thin tributary feeding into an ocean of unconsciousness. "I'm nobody," the gunman said. "He knows I'm nobody. That's why his voice cracked again. That's why he thought he could rob me. Rip me off for $3,000 and walk away." Katie was 5 feet away now. Far enough that the shotgun could still hurt her. Close enough that she could see the tremor in his hands wasn't just the gun's weight. It was fear. It was the kind of terror that comes from knowing you've already crossed a line you can't uncross, and the only exit left is through worse. $3,000, Katie said. Her voice had taken on the quality of someone talking to an injured animal, measured, calm, carrying the weight of someone who understood that one wrong word could trigger the wrong response. "That's why you followed him here." "He deserved it," the man said. But his voice had shifted. It wasn't a justification anymore. It was a question. A plea. A man asking himself if what he'd already done could possibly be worth what came next. Katie had talked down a Taliban fighter once, back in Helmand province. 17-year-old kid with a Russian-made rifle and a dead father. Katie had been the medic, treating locals in what was supposed to be a secure zone, when the kid had walked into the field hospital holding the rifle like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. Everyone else had hit the floor. Katie had stood up, walked toward him, and spent 47 minutes talking about his father, about grief, about the fact that pulling a trigger wouldn't bring the man back. The kid had put the gun down. Had sat in the dirt and cried for an hour. Had accepted a bottle of water and a package of crackers. Had walked away. This was different. This man was chemically unpredictable. His adrenaline and whatever combination of stimulants were running through his system had him operating on a threshold between panic and violence. One loud noise, one sudden movement, one perceived threat, and the shotgun would fire. At this range, there would be no saving anyone on that operating table. "You're not a killer," Katie said. The words came out like a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty a medic uses to tell a patient that the bleeding will stop, the pain will ease, that they're going to make it. "I can see that. I've seen killers. Real ones. Combat veterans. People who've killed in defense of people they love. You're not that. You're someone who made a bad choice because you were desperate. But it's not too late to make a better one." The shotgun wavered. Dropped maybe 2 inches. "How do you know?" the man whispered. "Because killers have a look," Katie said. "A weight they carry that you can see in their eyes. You don't have that. What you have is panic. What you have is fear. And fear is something I can work with." 6 feet away. Maybe less. "Step back," the man said. The gun came up again, but it was slower this time. The motion of someone moving through water instead of air. Katie didn't move. "I'm not going to step back. I'm going to stand right here and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen next if you pull that trigger. You're going to kill a man who's already unconscious. You're going to kill a surgical team that's trying to save his life. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in a cage remembering this moment. Knowing you could have walked away. Knowing you chose this instead." The room pressed inward. The ventilator's rhythmic hiss. The beep of the cardiac monitor tracking a heartbeat that didn't belong to anyone in the room anymore, just the anesthesia, just the drugs keeping the colonel suspended in that place between life and death. The fluorescent lights overhead carried a faint electrical hum, the sound of something burning slowly. "You made a mistake," Katie continued. Her voice dropped to something almost gentle, the tone a mother uses when a child has fallen and scraped a knee. "You made a mistake and you're scared. I understand scared. I've been scared. I've been so scared I thought my heart would explode. But I didn't let the fear make the decision. I let myself think past it. I let myself remember that there's still time. There's still time for you to choose something different." The gunman's eyes had started to glisten. His breathing was coming in hiccups now, the shotgun's muzzle drifting down and to the left. "Put it down," Katie said. Her voice had taken on a weight now, a command wrapped in compassion. "Right now. Last chance to choose something different. You put that gun down and you walk away, and maybe, there's still a future where you're not sitting in a cell remembering this moment for the next 30 years. The shotgun's muzzle pointed at the floor. The gunman's hands were shaking so hard Katie could see the subtle movement of the barrel. "I'm going on break," Katie said quietly. The words came out of nowhere, dry and measured in a way that made the gunman's eyes snap toward her. It was the kind of thing a person said when they were so far past the edge of panic that only absurdity could bring them back. "I'm going to step away and I'm going to let you put that gun down on the floor. And then you're going to sit down. And then you're going to cry, probably for a while. And then this is going to be over. One choice. That's all it takes." The shotgun lowered. The barrel kissed the tile floor. And that was when Dr. Blackwell's voice cut through from the hallway like a blade. "Security. Shooter in OR 3. Lock it down." The alarm started blaring. 3 distinct tones running over each other, creating a wall of sound that echoed off the operating room walls and made the entire space feel like the inside of a siren. The gunman's entire body convulsed. His eyes went wild. The shotgun came up. Katie moved. She closed the distance in 2 strides, each footfall precise and deliberate. Hands up. No hesitation. No calculation. Just muscle memory and training taking over the way they always did when thinking had to stop and action had to begin. She got her left hand on the barrel as his finger tightened on the trigger, used her body weight and 3 years of combatives training to leverage the weapon away from her center line while her right hand swept his legs out from under him. The shotgun clattered across the tile with a sound like a dropped engine block. The gunman fell hard, the impact knocking the air out of his lungs, and Katie was already moving back toward the table. The cardiac monitor was screaming. "Flat line. Perfect. Terrible flat line." The kind of silence that lives inside sound, the absence of a heartbeat translated into an alarm that shattered the world. Katie's hands moved. Left hand on the sternal notch. Right hand finding the xiphoid process. The colonel's ribs were solid under her palms, the ribs of a man who'd spent his life in uniform, who'd carried weapons and armor and the weight of command. She started compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The count became a meditation, a rhythm that existed outside of time. The surgical team had cleared back in, Dr. Blackwell shouting from the corner, but his voice was just noise. Just static. Katie's world had contracted to a single point, 120 compressions per minute, 100 to 120 millimeters of depth, chest recoiling back to its normal position between compressions. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Blackwell on his phone in the hallway, voice low and urgent. "Yes, I'm confirming her employment records. There may be some irregularities we need to look into. I have 3 colleagues willing to speak about competency concerns." The colonel's ribs felt like they might crack. Katie pushed harder. She'd cracked ribs during compressions before. She'd done it in a field hospital in Marja with a teenage boy who'd stepped on an IED. She'd done it because broken ribs meant the patient had a chance. Intact ribs and a stopped heart meant death. She cracked ribs. "Epi going in," the anesthesiologist said. The epinephrine syringe went into the fall line. They had maybe 90 seconds. Maybe less. The human body under cardiac arrest was like a house with all the lights going out one by one, and there was a specific window of time before the darkness became permanent. The monitor showed nothing. Flat line, still flat line, still flat line. Katie kept pushing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's when the next voice cut through, not Dr. Blackwell's, not the surgical team's, but something coming from outside the room. The sound of boots. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving fast. The sound of authority arriving like a thunderstorm. The crash cart rammed against the surgical table with the sound of intent. Katie didn't hesitate. She grabbed a scalpel from the instrument tray, the blade catching the overhead light like a predator's tooth, and looked at the cardiac monitor. Flat line. The sound was an electric hum that meant everything was ending. The surgeon who had fled was edging back into the room now, his voice uncertain, reaching for authority he'd already abandoned. "We need to wait for the team. We can't just." He's got a hemothorax compressing his heart. Katie's voice wasn't loud. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be. "If we wait, he's dead. Move." She didn't wait for permission. Her hands moved with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this before, in a dirt floor field hospital in Marja with mortar rounds walking across the compound like footsteps of God. The scalpel went in at the 5th intercostal space, left anterolateral thoracotomy, the blade parting skin and muscle and fascia like she was opening a book she'd already read 1,000 times. Blood welled up hot and dark. The charge nurse whispered, "Oh my God," 3 times, a prayer or a curse, it didn't matter. Katie's hands weren't shaking. Not yet. The trembling was restraint, the kind that came from knowing exactly how much violence a body could survive if you did it right. She cracked the ribs open with her fingers, actually felt them separate under pressure, that specific resistance that told you the angle was correct. The lung collapsed away from her touch. There. The bleed. A laceration in the left pulmonary artery, probably from a fractured rib that had turned into shrapnel the moment the bullet hit. She clamped it with a vascular clamp she'd grabbed in the same motion, her movements operating at a different speed than the rest of the room, like she was underwater and everyone else was drowning. Manual cardiac compression. Her palm against his heart, pushing, pumping, feeling for the specific rhythm that meant life was still possible. Once. Twice. Again. The surgeon was standing frozen, watching a floor nurse do something that shouldn't be possible, and Katie could feel his stare the way you feel a targeting laser on your chest. "Epi. 1 milligram 4, she said. Someone pushed it. The drug hit the bloodstream and the colonel's heart convulsed under her hand. She felt it. Felt the specific moment it decided to beat again on its own, that electrical rebellion against death, that refusal. Katie stepped back. Stripped off her gloves. Her hands were steady. The surgeon moved forward to finish what she'd started, to take over the case, to reclaim the narrative of heroism from a woman who hadn't asked for it. But the colonel's vitals were climbing now. BP stabilizing. O2 sat rising from 58 to 72 to 88. Sinus rhythm. The kind of recovery that didn't happen unless someone had done something impossible. Katie walked out of the operating room without waiting to be dismissed. The hallway was still echoing with the sound of security arriving, boots on linoleum, radio chatter, the controlled chaos of an institutional response to violence. She peeled off her surgical gown and threw it into the biohazard bin with the kind of precise anger that looked like control. But Blackwell was waiting in the hallway outside the OR prep area, phone still in his hand, his face a shade of white that meant something had broken inside him beyond just professional pride. He'd watched her. He'd seen what she did, and he understood in that moment what he'd been attacking all along. That night, alone in his office, he activated his network. 3 board members who owed him favors, he called each one personally, his voice steady but his hands shaking as he spoke. "I need to discuss Morrison's employment file. There are serious questions about her credentials. Her clinical behavior today was reckless. Outside her scope of practice. Potentially dangerous." He filed the complaint with Human Resources at 11:13 p.m., when the hospital was mostly empty and his words would echo through email servers without immediate contradiction. He made an anonymous call to the hospital's ethics line, the kind designed to protect whistleblowers, which made it impossible to trace back to him. "I have concerns about a nursing staff member with unverified credentials. She's been practicing outside her scope. The administration needs to investigate." By morning, Katie had a certified letter waiting at her apartment. Administrative leave, effective immediately, pending investigation into her employment history and qualifications. The letter was professionally worded, legally careful, and designed to sound like normal procedure. But the message was clear: Blackwell had won. He had weaponized the system the way men like him always did, with calls and favors and anonymous tips that were deniable and devastating. Katie sat at her kitchen table at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Thursday. The light through the window was the color of surrender. Her daughter Emma found her there, still in her scrubs with the blood dried along the cuffs, her hands folded in front of her like she was holding something that was trying to escape. "Mom." Emma's voice was small, confused. 8 years old, and she'd never seen her mother like this. "Why are you home? Are you sick?" Katie tried to answer. The words wouldn't come. She'd walked away from the military when the PTSD made her hands shake so badly she couldn't sleep, when the sound of a car backfiring sent her back to a convoy in Helmand Province that she'd never actually left. She'd chosen anonymity, chosen a civilian job 2,000 miles from anyone who knew what she was, what she'd done, what she'd survived. She'd never told her parents, never told her sister, never told anyone at Oak Creek Memorial the truth about the scars on her hands or the way certain smells triggered her nervous system like an alarm she couldn't turn off. She'd tried so hard to disappear. And she still ended up broken. Emma climbed into her lap. She was almost too big for that now, all gangly 8-year-old limbs and the particular weight of a child who needed her mother to be solid. Katie held her like she was drowning. Like her daughter was the only thing keeping her from sinking into water that was rising faster than she could breathe. "It's okay, Mommy," Emma whispered, and those 4 words were the most devastating thing Katie had heard all day. 3 days later, the charge nurse found her at her locker, pulling out the last of her personal items, a faded photograph of her with her daughter, a ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" from an agency gift exchange, a single dog tag on a broken chain that she'd kept hidden under every uniform for 7 years. Morrison. The charge nurse looked uncertain, like she was walking across a floor that might give way beneath her. The patient from the shooting. The GSW victim. He's awake. He's asking for someone. He keeps saying this word and we don't understand it. He's agitated. Won't calm down until we find. She paused. He won't tell us who. Katie's stomach dropped. She'd been trying not to think about the colonel, trying to construct a wall between the woman she'd been in Marja and the woman she'd become in Philadelphia. But walls didn't work when you were both people simultaneously. She followed the charge nurse to room 347 without speaking. The door opened and time collapsed into a single point. The colonel was propped up in bed with tubes running into both arms, his chest bandaged, his eyes fixed on the doorway with the kind of focus that came from someone who'd been waiting for this moment for 7 years. The room went silent. Not the absence of sound, the presence of it, thick and heavy and full of weight. The colonel's lips moved. One word, whispered like a prayer. "Reaper." The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. "Reaper." The word hung in the air like a prayer spoken in a language nobody else understood. Katie stood motionless in the doorway of room 347, her hand still wrapped around the frame, and Colonel Raymond Voss's eyes, the same eyes that had signed her court-martial papers 7 years ago in Marja, locked directly onto hers with the intensity of a laser finding its target. His face was pale, his breathing still labored from the ventilator they'd extubated just hours earlier, but his voice when he whispered that call sign again was steady. "Reaper." Not a question. A recognition. A reckoning. Katie didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply stood there as the machinery around them continued its steady electronic pulse, the heart monitor beeping its reassuring rhythm, the fore-drip hissing its metronomic cadence. Her hands felt cold. Not from fear. From something older. Something she'd buried so deep that 7 years and 2,000 miles hadn't been enough to kill it. The colonel's mouth moved again, forming her call sign one more time, and she understood in that moment that every choice she'd made, every humiliation she'd swallowed, every insult she'd walked away from, every morning she'd woken up pretending to be someone smaller than she was, had been leading directly to this bed, this room, this man. The charge nurse stood frozen in the corner, not understanding what was happening but sensing it anyway, the way prey animals sense the presence of something apex. Katie finally stepped into the room. Her boots made no sound on the tile. She'd learned long ago how to move without announcing herself. The Colonel's hand trembled on the blanket, and she realized with a strange clarity that he was crying. Tears tracked down both sides of his weathered face like rain on a windshield, and his lips moved silently before he managed words. "You saved us. That night. You carried Garrett and Martinez. 11 miles. His voice cracked. "I've been looking for you for 7 years. Katie pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down slowly, her movements precise as a predator settling into stillness. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It wasn't the careful, measured tone she'd used with Dr. Blackwell. This was the voice of someone who'd given orders in the dark while people's blood ran hot on their hands. "You court-martialed me, sir." She said it not with anger but with a kind of clinical accuracy, the way a surgeon might describe the size of a tumor. "You destroyed everything I built." The Colonel nodded, his chest heaving. "I was wrong. The investigation proved it. Your team was ambushed because of faulty intel from the command center, my command center. I signed off on the operation. When everything went wrong, I needed someone to blame." He paused, swallowed hard. "I chose you." The veteran security guard who'd been standing post outside the room heard the tension in their voices and stepped into the doorway, hand on his belt, ready to intervene if needed. But then he heard Katie say, "You were a coward then, sir," and something in her voice made him freeze. Made him really look at her. And then he saw it, something in the set of her shoulders, the way her eyes moved like she was calculating distances and angles. The guard's hand went slack. When Katie looked up at him, he straightened, and understanding flooded his face like a sunrise. "Wait. Reaper 6? Are you Colonel Morrison?" His voice came out half question, half recognition. "3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." Katie didn't answer him directly. She turned back to Voss, and the Colonel continued, words spilling out like he'd been storing them for 7 years and couldn't contain them anymore. "The court-martial was overturned in 2019. Real evidence surfaced showing the intelligence failure originated from my office. You were completely cleared." His voice strengthened, pulling from some reserve of authority that even his injuries couldn't diminish. "Your service record was restored. Your team, Garrett and Martinez, they both testified to the full investigation board about what you did that night. They've been trying to find you ever since. We all have." The Colonel's eyes searched hers. "You're a Silver Star recipient, Colonel Morrison. You were always supposed to be a Silver Star recipient." The security guard stepped back out into the hallway, and Katie heard him say something quietly into his radio. She knew what he was doing. She knew that word was spreading through Oak Creek Memorial that the woman they'd all treated as a liability, as someone to be discarded and isolated, was something entirely different. That everything Dr. Blackwell had done, every calculated humiliation, every orchestrated abandonment, all of it had been aimed at someone he'd had no idea existed. And that knowledge would move through the hospital like electricity through water. What she didn't know was that the Marine Corps IT director at Oak Creek Memorial, a man named Paul Reeves who'd served 2 tours in Helmand Province, was sitting at his desk on the 4th floor at that exact moment. Reeves had been in the hallway when the Colonel whispered her call sign. Reeves had heard the security guard confirm her rank. And Reeves, who understood exactly what it meant that a decorated special operations officer had just identified one of Oak Creek's floor nurses as someone the military had been searching for, did what he did best. He pulled every email Dr. Blackwell had sent about Katie Morrison. Every single one. He accessed the security logs that Blackwell had attempted to delete, video footage of Blackwell in the OR hallway the night of the shooting, making phone calls, his face tight with rage and desperation. He found the falsified incident reports. He traced the phone records showing Blackwell's calls to 3 board members at 2:53 a.m., coordinating what could only be described as a targeted campaign. Reeves worked for 6 hours without stopping. He compiled 40 pages of documentation, emails timestamped and referenced, security footage with timestamps, phone records with call duration and recipients, falsified HR documents side by side with the actual incident logs. He added a narrative explaining that the nurse being targeted was an active-duty colonel in the United States military with a service record so classified that only a handful of people in the hospital had security clearance to access it. He signed the document, copied it to the hospital legal department, the Joint Commission, and 3 different offices at the State Medical Board. He hit send at 2:34 p.m., and in that moment, Dr. Blackwell's career stopped existing. 2 days later, Blackwell walked into a conference room on the executive floor expecting to meet with the department head about staffing. Instead, he found hospital administration, the board's legal counsel, and a woman from the State Medical Board sitting at the table. They presented the evidence methodically. 40 pages. Video. Timestamps. Phone records. The document spread across the mahogany table like a crime scene photograph. Blackwell's face cycled through confusion, then understanding, then a kind of frantic desperation. He tried to explain. She was insubordinate. She was a liability. She'd endangered patients. But they played the video of him attempting to delete security footage, and his voice died in his throat. They showed him the emails where he'd explicitly coordinated with board members to remove her. Where he'd written, "I need her gone by end of week." Where he'd told one board member, "She's not even a real nurse." His medical license was suspended pending a formal investigation. He was terminated from Oak Creek Memorial within the hour. The veteran security guard, the same one who'd recognized Katie's call sign, escorted him from the building. Blackwell tried to explain to the guard that there'd been a misunderstanding, that Katie Morrison was unqualified and dangerous. The security guard said nothing. His silence was a more damning response than any words could have been. His contempt was a physical presence, a pressure in the air like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Blackwell tried to find work at other Philadelphia area hospitals. But Paul Reeves's report had moved through medical networks with the speed of a virus. No hospital would hire him. His reputation had been incinerated in the time it took to hit send. His wife received calls from reporters within 48 hours. She filed for separation after photographs of Blackwell appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. He lost the house in Media Township to foreclosure 6 months later. And then one afternoon, as he sat at a folding table in a strip mall parking lot in Haverford, selling discount auto insurance for $20 an hour, he understood that the woman he'd tried so carefully to destroy had saved his life. Because if he'd succeeded in removing her, if she hadn't been in that operating room when Colonel Voss arrived, the colonel would have bled out on the trauma table. And when that investigation followed, and it would have followed, because special operations officers don't just appear in civilian hospitals every day, everything would have come to light anyway. Except then Blackwell would have been guilty of something far worse than harassment. He would have been guilty of manslaughter. 6 months after the medical board suspended his license, Katie walked past that same strip mall on her way to her car after her shift. She'd been reinstated at Oak Creek Memorial with a formal written apology from hospital administration. She'd been promoted to ICU clinical supervisor, a position she'd initially refused because accepting it felt like claiming something she wasn't sure she deserved. But the colonel and Paul Reeves had sat down with her in the break room during her lunch break and explained, very simply, that refusing the promotion was the same as letting Blackwell win. So she'd accepted. And for the first time in 7 years, Katie's hands didn't shake when she was working. Her hands shook sometimes, yes, at 3 a.m. when Emma asked about the scars, at therapy sessions when her psychiatrist asked her to name the things she was most afraid of, but not at work. At work, her hands were steady as a surgical laser. She glanced at the strip mall almost without thinking, the way you glance at anything that catches your peripheral vision. And there, behind a folding table with a banner reading Discount Auto Insurance, Low Rates, sat Dr. Harrison Blackwell in a cheap polo shirt with the store logo stitched on the pocket. His face had aged 10 years in 6 months. He was talking to a couple who looked completely uninterested, his voice carrying that same condescending tone he'd used so many times in the hospital hallways. His eyes met Katie's for a fraction of a second. She saw the moment he recognized her. She saw his face go white. She saw him start to open his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain, perhaps just to acknowledge that he'd seen her. Katie didn't stop. She didn't slow. She didn't acknowledge him in any way. She just kept walking toward her car, toward Emma waiting in the back seat doing her algebra homework, toward her apartment in University City where her therapist's business card sat on the kitchen counter. She walked toward the life she'd finally allowed herself to reclaim. And behind her, Dr. Blackwell sat down slowly in his folding chair, his mouth still open, understanding finally that there was no redemption waiting for him. There was only the daily humiliation of selling insurance to people who didn't respect him, the quiet knowledge that everywhere he went, eventually someone would know what he'd tried to do, and the certainty that he deserved every second of it. That evening, Katie met Colonel Voss for coffee at the place he always chose, the place with the big windows and good sightlines where he could see the door. They'd been meeting monthly, his attempt at amends that had slowly, almost without either of them noticing, become something like friendship. He was starting to look healthy again. The ventilator damage to his lungs was healing. The surgical scar where Katie had performed the emergency thoracotomy, where she'd opened his chest with a combat knife and found the lacerated pulmonary artery and clamped it with her own hands, had faded to a thin white line. He'd told her once that scar was proof that she'd saved him. Proof that Colonel Katie Morrison was still real, still present, still capable of the extraordinary things he'd always known she was capable of. Voss slid a small cardboard box across the table. "I brought something," he said quietly. Inside was her silver star, hanging from its pale blue ribbon with the stars. And next to it, her rank insignia. "Colonel." The colonel reached out and touched them but didn't take them out of the box. "I don't know if I'm that person anymore," she said. Voss smiled, and it was a smile that carried 7 years of searching, of guilt, of understanding what he'd stolen from her. "You walked toward a gunman while everyone else ran. You're exactly that person." Katie picked up the box and tucked it carefully into her bag, and as she stood to leave, she said something over her shoulder, something she'd been thinking about Blackwell sitting at that folding table, about the way the world was patient and terrible and exactly fair. True class is what you do when the lights go out. She walked out into the Philadelphia evening where the parking lot was already emptying, where the rain had stopped and the air smelled like wet concrete and the promise of something new. Emma was waiting in the car, homework spread across the back seat, and when Katie slid into the driver's seat, her daughter looked up and smiled like she always did, that pure, uncomplicated smile of someone who just loved someone else. Katie started the engine and pulled out into traffic, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt like she was finally home. If you've watched this far, you already know that the people who matter, the ones who really matter, they always recognize you, even after years of hiding. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes who walk among us, and comment below, would you have saved him, or would you have walked away?